Hi, this is Jay Richards. We are here at the COSM Technology Summit 2023 in Bellevue, Washington, and we just finished a keynote speech by the famous Michael Milken. And Michael, I say the famous because I've been hearing your name for decades, and it's such a pleasure to get to meet you in person and talk to you for a few minutes.
Well, it's great to be here.
Well, so George introduced you. I cannot possibly sort of do justice to his introduction of you. The reference to the companies which in the 1980s you initially helped get capital for, that's in the trillions of dollars of value in 2023. Is that right?
Well, we began in '69.
Yep.
And yes, the thousands of companies employ tens of millions of people today, and the market is in the trillions of dollars. Yes.
Wow, I didn't know that until George mentioned it. What's funny is that you came here at COSM to talk about something completely different. You've been working now for decades on bioscience and medical cures, and in fact, you have this brand new book, Faster Cures, which you talked a little bit about. And so let's start there. What's your hope with the book, Faster Cures?
Well, we had a situation occur in 2020, a worldwide pandemic occurred, and I was at our conference in Johannesburg and starting to fly back, and I felt a dark cloud in February starting to spread throughout, and I landed and I got everyone that worked for our medical foundations and our Milken Institute together and told us we would all be judged by what we do here. And a one day shortening this crisis was worth 10 to 25,000 lives. And so I wrote this book because it lays out the last 5 decades of what happened in medical research, what's occurred, and how we changed the course of history, but particularly what we did building up to the infrastructure that allowed us in 9 weeks to give a vaccine to people once we sequenced the DNA of the virus. Just 63 days. And within a year, it was going into millions of people and approved. And the problem that you have anytime there's a crisis, whether it's a medical or anything, people get geared up for the crisis, and when the crisis is over, they let down their guard and they go back to deal with the next crisis. And I wrote this book to say we are on the verge of eliminating disease as we know it, extending the quality of life and the length of life. And if we could just stay at the same pace we've been running, we might find diseases like cancer in the history books rather than face them over the next decade.
So is what you're worried about the sort of kind of regulatory state suddenly after the pandemic passed and the kind of resuscitation of the regulatory state suppressing what you think would otherwise happen?
Yes, and diverting resources away. The cost of the pandemic to just the United States and the human loss is infinite. But the financial cost was probably $1 trillion a month. And so an investment of tens of billions of dollars was small relative to what it was costing this country and what it was costing the world. And today, you have technologies like focused ultrasound, where non-invasive surgery, yes, I grew up with Star Trek and bones never had invasive surgery, but it's a reality today. And more than 50 or 60 diseases have been approved to be treated by focused ultrasound using sound waves. You walk in, you walk out as an outpatient. And it started with tremors. It's being used for cancer now, Parkinson's, and many other diseases.
So do you think, what would be the key impediments then? Would it be lack of access to capital, regulation? What's your sense?
The first one is access to knowledge. And just because, what did we learn? Just because you found a solution doesn't mean everyone is gravitating towards that solution. And that includes the medical professional community. They are giving the best advice to their patient, but they might not be current on what the best treatment is. So getting that information out is essential. Dealing with regulation, much of which still relates to the 19th century.
Right.
And bringing it forward today. You know, for example, many insurance, in order to be reimbursed, require you to get biopsies before you get an MRI.
Yes.
If you got the MRI first, let's just pick prostate cancer, for example, you'd have much more knowledge. And the potential risk of doing a biopsy, an invasive biopsy, maybe you don't have to do. But the regulation hasn't kept up with technology.
And so doctors prefer the biopsy for regulatory reasons rather than for basic medical
Well,
reasons.
you might not be able to get reimbursed if you didn't do that first. They won't approve an MRI. So many of these technologies and the use of AI, today I talked a little bit about the fact that there is no pathologist that can analyze a melanoma that's been loaded to what you can in a computer today. And so we need to find a way to adjust to what technology. Today, I can sequence your genome. I can sequence your disease. I can sequence your microbiome. I know who you are. I don't have to treat you for a general disease. I can treat you for your disease. And therefore, when you say you have breast cancer, there's many forms of breast cancer. You might have a particular mutation, so we want to make sure we're giving you the right medicine. And the other thing we've learned is CRISPR technology is coming, not for at least a decade, that we'll be able to change your genes. But the risk of changing your genes is when we change your genes, we've created a new human race. And so right now, we can change the way your genes are expressed by changing your microbiome, what you eat, and your diet. And in fact, this year, they have now approved a treatment where I can take the microbiome of an individual that, say, responded well to cancer treatment and give it to an individual who responded poorly. And that individual has a much better chance for better outcomes. So we have already begun to understand what the microbiome is capable of doing and how it can change how your genes are expressed.
That's fascinating. Well, you pivoted. I wasn't actually expecting it, but you, at the end of your speech before George Gilder had asked you some questions, you ended by saying that we should run toward the hard problems. And then George said, well, the hardest problem today, this is George, is demographics. We've forgotten how to have children. And you had some very interesting things to say about that.
Well, it's not that we've forgotten how.
Sure.
You know, the societies have changed, and as we become wealthier, per capita income, and we're talking about per capita income levels of only $2,000 a year, so very low, as women get educated. But the other amazing thing is, in 1900, 50% of all children born died before their 5th birthday. So if you wanted to have 3 kids, you had to have 6. Today, with modern science, if I just took you back 30 years, the probability of a woman passing AIDS on to her child in birth was 95 to 98%. Today, with modern technology, it's 2 or 3%. So the children are born to mothers who have HIV or AIDS, not with HIV and AIDS. And so we're about to see in a few countries in sub-Saharan Africa a doubling of life expectancy in 1 generation. Just 1 generation. Southeast Asia experienced a doubling of life expectancy in 2. So you don't need as many children if the children aren't dying. Even in the United States, 20% of all children died by their 5th birthday in 1900. Today, 20% of the population dies by their mid-60s. So it isn't that simple, and many of the foundations that were focused on birth control and population control, most of the countries in the world today, birth rate is below replacement.
And you mentioned a few, though, of course, Nigeria and places like that, compared to, say, South Korea, which is way below replacement rate, and Nigeria that's still above. What's the sort of implication of that over, say, the next 20 or 30 years, you think?
Well, the entire net growth of the world's population was going to be in sub-Saharan Africa. So they'll either create opportunities there, or
Right.
they'll be here all over the world from that standpoint. And so many of the people that have been worried about the enormous explosion of the world's population,
Yes.
Every single country in Europe, birth rate is below replacement. Every country in Northern Asia, Japan, Korea, China, is well below replacement. Every single country in other parts, the United States and Canada, well below replacement. And Mexico today is right about at replacement levels. So there's parts of the world that are growing, but the main growth in the world's population has come from living longer and healthier lives.
Yeah. And so, and then you ended talking, I was surprised, about the American dream, which I know Americans were in a sort of pessimistic mood at the moment. But you said actually, when you asked this question about the American dream, defined, if I recall, in terms of the possibility to have a better life with sort of access to support based upon hard work and capacity or ability.
Not based on your religion, not
Yep.
based on whether you're a man or a woman, etc. When you interview people, I would say of the thousands that we've interviewed, 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 sheds tears with a stranger interviewing him, thinking about the sacrifices their ancestors or they made today. And the access to upward mobility is not equal in this country. Zip code plays a major
Sure.
role in this country, but many of our research efforts are, once we understand why upward mobility is far less in Charlotte, North Carolina than, say, Salt Lake, you do the analysis, and it's begun to change. But the world believes in this ideal of the American dream, say America with a small a,
Right.
this basic opportunity and hope. And so that's why we're building the center across from the White House and Treasury, to really be a symbol of hope and tell stories. Attached to it are 6 centers of research to do research on what are the barriers to advancement, and so we can remove those barriers or change those barriers. But I don't think people in the United States recognize how optimistic most of the emerging or developing world is. So if you go to Europe or you go to the United States and ask, is your life going to be better than your parents of people under 30? The vast majority say no. You go to Mexico, South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, as much as 95% say their life will be better.
That's something important for all of us to realize and to recognize. Very hopeful thought.
Well, the advances in health, just to think that we have moved in the last 120 years, life expectancy on the planet from 31 to mid-70s. There are countries now that life expectancy is in the mid-80s. And so it's a dramatic change. Cancer alone, 30 years ago when I was diagnosed, or 50 years ago when I began funding cancer research, if you told someone you had cancer, people would think you're going to die.
Yeah.
Today, there are 18 million people just in the United States living normal lives in total remission.
Wow. Michael Milken, this has been absolutely terrific. Thanks so much for joining me.
Great. Good health to you.
And to you. Thank you. And thank you for joining us. We're here at COSM Technology Summit 2023.